October 19, 1944. In a cramped briefing room somewhere in occupied France, 23 women of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps sat rigid on wooden benches, listening to their commanding officer describe the enemy they would soon face. Oberleutnant Klaus Werner stood before a faded map of America, his pointer tapping against the coastline with sharp, deliberate strikes. The women leaned forward, absorbing every word as if their lives depended on it. In many ways, they did. "Remember what you have learned," Werner said, his voice carrying the certainty of absolute truth. "The Americans are a weak people, grown soft from their distance from real conflict. Their soldiers fight only because they have been deceived by Jewish propaganda. Their country is collapsing from within. Starvation spreads through their cities. Their people queue for hours to receive meager rations of bread and thin soup." He paused, letting his words sink into the minds of the young women before him. "If you are captured, and I pray to God you will not be, you must remember this. The Americans will try to break you with lies about abundance that does not exist. They will show you propaganda photographs of food that their own citizens cannot obtain. Do not believe their deceptions." 24-year-old Liesel Voss sat in the third row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gray auxiliary uniform pressed to perfection. She had joined the Women's Corps 2 years earlier, believing she was serving her fatherland's defense against the forces that threatened to destroy German civilization. Her role as a communication specialist had kept her away from the front lines, but close enough to hear the sounds of artillery in the distance. She copied down Werner's words in her small leather notebook, the same notebook where she recorded everything she believed to be true and important. Next to her sat Frieda Zimmermann, a nurse from Bremen, whose gentle hands had treated wounded soldiers in field hospitals across France. Frieda's face remained expressionless, but her fingers twisted the fabric of her skirt beneath the bench where no one could see. "The American soldier is poorly trained and cowardly," Werner continued. "They rely on superior numbers and equipment stolen from British factories. Their food supplies are so limited that their own troops go hungry. This is why they fight so desperately, you understand? They are trying to steal the resources of Europe to feed their starving nation." The women nodded, some taking notes, others simply committing the information to memory. 19-year-old Greta Schreiber, the youngest among them, felt a cold fear settle in her stomach. She had heard stories of American brutality, of prisoners left to starve in cages, of casual cruelty inflicted on captured Germans. If what Oberleutnant Werner said was true, capture would mean slow death from hunger and neglect. "If the worst happens," Werner concluded, "maintain your dignity. Remember that you represent the German people, and remember above all that everything the Americans tell you will be lies designed to break your spirit." 3 weeks later, Liesel Voss would remember these words as she stood before a table loaded with more food than she had seen in 2 years. November 7, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of a makeshift prisoner facility outside Fort Deans, Massachusetts, carrying 17 German women who had been captured during the Allied advance through Belgium. Liesel pressed her face against the small window, trying to see through the autumn rain that blurred everything into gray shapes. Her leather notebook sat heavy in her pocket, filled with warnings about what to expect from American captivity. She had read those notes a dozen times during the long journey across the Atlantic, preparing herself for the starvation and cruelty that Oberleutnant Werner had promised awaited them. The truck jerked to a stop. American soldiers opened the rear doors, their faces neutral and professional. Liesel had expected to see hatred in their eyes, perhaps even savage pleasure at having captured enemy women. Instead, she saw only tired young men doing their duty, their expressions no different than German guards she had known. The women climbed down from the truck, their auxiliary uniforms still bearing the insignia they had worn with pride just weeks ago. Rain soaked through the gray wool immediately, but they stood straight despite the cold, maintaining the military bearing that had been drilled into them since training. Captain Vivian Caldwell stood waiting beneath the shelter of the administration building overhang. At 36, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than demanding it through rank. Her dark hair was pinned back severely, and her uniform showed the wear of someone who worked alongside her soldiers, rather than simply commanding from behind a desk. She observed the German women with careful assessment, noting their youth, their attempt at dignity despite obvious exhaustion, and the fear they were trying to hide behind rigid postures. "Welcome to Fort Deans," Captain Caldwell said in clear, measured English. A young corporal stepped forward to translate, but she raised her hand to stop him. "Some of you may speak English. Those who do not will learn. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be given adequate food, shelter, and medical care. You will be assigned work duties appropriate to your skills. You will not be mistreated." Liesel understood most of the words, though the captain's accent was different from the British English she had studied in school. The promise of adequate food registered as confirmation of what Werner had warned them about. The Americans would claim to feed them adequately while providing starvation rations. It was a psychological tactic, making promises they had no intention of keeping. Frida stood beside her, shivering from cold and fear. Greta looked even younger than her 19 years, her face pale and her eyes wide. Thea Engel, at 27, the oldest among them, kept her expression carefully blank, revealing nothing of what she was thinking. They were led into a low wooden building that would serve as their barracks. Inside, 17 narrow beds waited, each with 2 folded blankets, a pillow, and a small wooden box for personal belongings. It was more than Liesel had expected, but she reminded herself that American deception would be subtle at first. The dining hall door opened at 1700 hours, releasing smells that made Liesel's stomach clench with involuntary hunger. She had been prepared for thin soup and hard bread, the kind of rations that barely sustained life. She had steeled herself to accept starvation with dignity, to prove that German women could endure anything their captor inflicted. What she was not prepared for was the sight that greeted the 17 prisoners as they entered the mess hall for their first meal in American captivity. Long tables filled the room, and at each place setting sat a metal tray divided into sections. Steam rose from the food, and the smell was overwhelming after months of wartime rations in occupied France. Corporal Eugene Whitlock, a lanky farm boy from Nebraska with sandy hair and an easy smile, gestured for the women to sit. His young face showed no malice, only the slightly awkward friendliness of someone trying to be welcoming to people he had been taught were enemies. Liesel sat slowly, staring at the tray before her. There was meat, actual meat, a thick slice of what appeared to be roasted beef. Beside it sat mashed potatoes with a pool of rich brown gravy, green beans that looked fresh rather than from a can, a slice of white bread with a pat of yellow butter, and a small dish containing what looked like chocolate. Pudding. Frida made a small sound beside her, something between a gasp and a sob. The other women stared at their trays with identical expressions of confusion and disbelief. This could not be real. This had to be some kind of elaborate theatrical production, propaganda food meant to be photographed but not actually eaten. Werner had warned them about exactly this kind of deception. Greta reached out tentatively, touching the edge of her tray as if to confirm it was real and not a hallucination brought on by hunger and exhaustion. "Please eat," Corporal Whitlock said through the translator. "It's real. It's yours." His voice carried genuine puzzlement, as if he could not understand why they were hesitating. To him, this was simply dinner, the same meal the American soldiers would eat in their own mess hall. Nothing special, nothing unusual, just Tuesday evening food. Liesel picked up her fork with trembling hands. She cut a small piece of the beef and raised it to her mouth. The taste exploded across her tongue with an intensity that made her eyes water. Rich, fatty, perfectly seasoned meat, Real beef, not the horse meat or mystery protein that had sustained the German military for the past 2 years, not the turnips and black bread that had become standard fare, not the watery soup stretched to feed too many people with too little. She chewed slowly, and with each movement of her jaw, a crack appeared in the foundation of everything she had been told. If the Americans were starving, if their nation was collapsing from within, if their soldiers were going hungry, then why was a prisoner eating better than she had eaten in 2 years of serving the Reich? 3 days passed in a fog of confusion and cognitive dissonance. Each meal arrived with the same impossible abundance. Breakfast brought eggs, actual eggs, scrambled and fluffy, served alongside strips of bacon that glistened with fat, toast with jam, and coffee with real cream. Lunch featured sandwiches thick, with meat and cheese, accompanied by apples so fresh and crisp they must have been picked recently, and cookies that tasted of butter and sugar. Dinner continued the pattern of plenty that contradicted everything the women had been taught about American deprivation. Liesel found herself unable to finish the portions given to her. Her stomach, shrunk from years of inadequate rations, could not physically accommodate the quantity of food the Americans considered normal. She watched Corporal Whitlock and the other guards eat the same meals, noting that they treated this abundance as completely ordinary. They did not guard their food jealously or hoard extra portions. They sometimes left food on their plates, scraping perfectly good meat into waste bins without a second thought. This casual relationship with plenty was more disturbing than any cruelty could have been. On the 4th day, Captain Caldwell ordered a special meal to welcome the prisoners and demonstrate American intentions regarding their treatment. The women entered the dining hall to find the tables arranged differently, decorated with autumn leaves and small American flags. The smell that filled the room was unlike anything they had experienced before. Rich, fatty, complex, and utterly foreign. Sergeant Wallace Drummond, a solid man in his 30s with careful eyes and a Pennsylvania accent, stood beside a large griddle where he was cooking something that sizzled and popped. "Today you will experience an American tradition," Captain Caldwell announced through the translator. "We call them hamburgers. Some of you may have heard of them. They are beef patties served on bread with various toppings. We thought you might enjoy trying something distinctly American." The translator struggled with the word hamburger, eventually just saying it in English and attempting to describe the concept. The women stood uncertain, watching as Sergeant Drummond assembled the food items with practiced efficiency. Ground beef patties, each one thick and substantial, sizzled on the griddle. He placed them on soft white buns, then added slices of bright yellow cheese that melted immediately from the heat of the meat. Lettuce, tomato, pickles, onions, and a red sauce he called ketchup completed each sandwich. When the plates were set before them, Liesel stared at the construction with complete incomprehension. The bun was soft and appeared fresh-baked. The meat patty was so thick she could see the grain of the ground beef, the cheese draped over the edges, still melting. The vegetables looked crisp and fresh. The entire thing was impossibly large, requiring 2 hands to hold. She looked at Frida, whose eyes had already filled with tears. This was not possible. This could not be prison food. This could not be what a starving nation fed to its enemies. She picked up the hamburger, feeling the weight of it, the warmth seeping through the bun into her palms, and took her first bite. The moment the hamburger touched Liesel's tongue, something broke inside her. The beef was rich and fatty, seasoned with salt and pepper, cooked so that the outside had a slight char, while the inside remained tender and juicy. The cheese added a creamy, salty layer that melted into the meat. The vegetables provided fresh crunch and brightness. The bun was soft and slightly sweet, holding everything together in a perfect combination of textures and flavors. It was not just food. It was abundance made tangible. It was everything she had been told could not exist in America. She managed 2 bites before the tears came, not delicate, silent tears that could be hidden or explained away. Deep, racking sobs that shook her entire body. Her hands trembled so violently that she had to set the hamburger down on her plate before she dropped it. Around her, other women were having identical reactions. Frida buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving. Greta stared at her hamburger and wept openly, making no attempt to hide her tears. Thea, who had maintained rigid composure since their capture, bit into her food and immediately began crying, with an intensity that suggested years of suppressed emotion finally breaking free. Corporal Whitlock looked alarmed, uncertain what to do. He glanced at Sergeant Drummond, who appeared equally confused by the reaction his cooking had provoked. Captain Caldwell moved through the dining hall, her face showing concern rather than satisfaction at having broken her prisoners. This was not the response she had anticipated. She had expected perhaps surprise, maybe appreciation, possibly suspicion. She had not expected this collective emotional collapse over hamburgers and cheese. "What's wrong?" she asked through the translator, directing her question to Liesel, who seemed to be trying to regain control of herself. "Is the food not acceptable? Are you ill?" Liesel struggled to find words in English adequate to explain what was happening. How could she articulate that every bite of this food destroyed a piece of the worldview she had built her entire adult life upon? How could she explain that the Reich had told them America was starving while feeding prisoners better than German soldiers ate? How could she convey that this simple sandwich represented a lie so enormous it threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew? "The meat," she finally managed in halting English. "There is so much meat, real meat, in every bite." Her voice broke on the last words. We were told America had no food, that your people were starving, that you fought to steal Europe's resources because your own nation was collapsing." She gestured helplessly at the hamburger, at the abundance surrounding them. "But you give this to prisoners? This is what you feed to enemies?" Captain Caldwell's expression shifted from concern to understanding. She pulled out a chair and sat across from Liesel, her posture conveying neither triumph nor pity, only honest directness. "You were lied to," Captain Caldwell said simply, her voice gentle but firm. "Everything you were told about America was a lie. We are not starving. Our cities are not collapsing. Our people have more food than they need, so much that we struggle to avoid waste. What you're eating now is ordinary food that any American family might have for dinner. Nothing special, nothing unusual, just Tuesday afternoon hamburgers." The translator conveyed her words carefully, but Liesel understood most of it directly. The captain's honesty was somehow more devastating than any cruelty could have been. The other women were listening now, their crying subsiding into quiet sniffles and shaking breaths. They looked at their hamburgers with new eyes, seeing not just food but evidence of a deception so vast it made their heads spin. If they had been lied to about American starvation, what else had been false? What other truths had been inverted, twisted, or completely fabricated? Frida wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks across her face. "At home," she said quietly in German, not caring if anyone understood. "At home we have had turnips and black bread for 2 years. The hospitals where I worked had no medicine, no supplies, no proper food for the wounded. We were told this was because America had blockaded us, starved us deliberately." She looked at her half-eaten hamburger. "But if America has all this, why would they need to steal from Europe?" Thea spoke up, her voice rough from crying. "I worked in administration. I processed supply reports. I saw the numbers showing our shortages, our desperate situation. The reports always said the enemy was suffering worse than we were, that their situation was more dire, that we just needed to hold on a little longer until their collapse." She laughed bitterly. "But they're not collapsing. They're feeding prisoners hamburgers with cheese." Over the following hour, as the women slowly finished their meals, the conversations grew more intense. They spoke in rapid German, their voices rising and falling as they debated, questioned, and tried to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been taught. Corporal Whitlock brought out a tray of dessert, individual slices of apple pie with vanilla ice cream, and the sight of it provoked fresh tears from several women. The casual abundance was relentless, each meal another hammer blow against the propaganda structure they had built their understanding upon. That evening, Liesel sat on her bunk and opened her leather notebook. She looked at the notes she had taken during Oberleutnant Werner's briefing, reading his words about American starvation and weakness. For the first time, she took her pencil and drew a single line through the entire page, then another, until the words were completely obscured. She turned to a fresh page and wrote in careful English, November 10th, 1944. Today, I learned that everything I believed was a lie. Today, I ate a hamburger and realized I know nothing. The days that followed the hamburger incident established a new normal in the camp. The German women began to accept that the abundance was real, though acceptance came slowly and brought its own form of psychological distress. Each meal reinforced the reality that they had been systematically deceived about the most basic facts of American life. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner arrived with predictable plenty, and the women struggled to adjust to portions that seemed enormous compared to what they had known in Germany. Liesel found herself drawn to the camp kitchen, watching Sergeant Drummond and the other cooks prepare meals. She had volunteered for kitchen duty partly to be useful and partly because she needed to see with her own eyes where all this food came from. The storage rooms shocked her. Rows of canned goods, sacks of flour and sugar, bins of fresh vegetables, and an entire refrigerated room filled with meat, eggs, and dairy products. This was not a special military stockpile reserved for propaganda purposes. This was simply what an ordinary American military facility maintained for daily operations. Sergeant Drummond noticed her fascination and began explaining things in simple English, speaking slowly so she could understand. He showed her how to make various American dishes, demonstrating techniques with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed teaching. He seemed to find her wonder at basic ingredients amusing, but not in a cruel way. More like someone watching a child discover something commonplace that the child found magical. "This here's just regular ground beef," he said, holding up a package. "Nothing fancy. Same stuff my wife uses back home in Harrisburg. Makes meatloaf, burgers, spaghetti sauce." He paused, studying her face. "You really never had meat like this before the war?" Liesel shook her head. "Before the war, yes, sometimes. But not for 2 years now. Maybe small amounts, but not—" She gestured at the abundance surrounding them. "Not like this. Not every day. Not so much." Her English was improving rapidly through these daily conversations. Drummond's expression shifted to something like sympathy. "That must have been hard, going hungry like that." He handed her an apron. "Well, you're here now. Might as well learn to cook American style. Could be useful someday." The other women found their own ways to process the revelations about American abundance. Frida spent hours in the small camp library, reading American newspapers and magazines with growing amazement. The advertisements alone told a story that contradicted years of German propaganda. Companies competing to sell food products, restaurants advertising all-you-can-eat specials, grocery stores boasting about their selection and prices. Greta, with her young curiosity, began asking Corporal Whitlock endless questions about American life. What did his family eat at home? Did they really have ice cream whenever they wanted? Were the pictures in magazines showing kitchen appliances and abundant pantries real or staged for propaganda? His answers were consistently mundane and therefore devastating. Yes, his family had a refrigerator. Yes, they ate meat several times a week. Yes, the photographs were real. By mid-November, Liesel had become Sergeant Drummond's unofficial assistant in the kitchen. She arrived each morning at 0500 hours to help prepare breakfast for both the prisoners and the American personnel. The work was physically demanding, but provided a sense of purpose that helped quiet the questions constantly churning in her mind. More importantly, the kitchen became a space where the normal boundaries between captor and captive blurred into something closer to colleagues working toward a common goal. Drummond taught her to make pancakes, a concept that initially baffled her. They're like thin cakes you eat for breakfast with syrup, he explained, demonstrating how to pour the batter onto the hot griddle in perfect circles. My kids love them. Put butter and maple syrup on top, maybe some berries if you've got them. He handed her the ladle. You try. Liesel's first attempts were misshapen and unevenly cooked, but Drummond simply nodded encouragement. That's fine. Nobody expects perfect circles. They taste the same regardless. His casual acceptance of imperfection was itself a revelation. Everything in her military training had emphasized precision and perfection as moral imperatives. The kitchen became a classroom where Liesel learned not just cooking techniques but fundamental truths about American culture through food. She learned that Americans put sugar in their cornbread, which seemed strange until she tasted it. She learned about regional variations, how Drummond's Pennsylvania Dutch background influenced his cooking differently than Corporal Whitlock's Nebraska farm traditions. She learned that Americans had absorbed food traditions from dozens of immigrant cultures, creating a culinary landscape that celebrated diversity rather than demanding conformity. One morning, Drummond arrived with a worn cookbook that his wife had sent from home. She thought you might like to see this, he said, handing it to Liesel. Figured if you're interested in cooking, this might help with your English too. The book was called The Joy of Cooking, and it was unlike any cookbook Liesel had seen in Germany. It assumed abundance. The recipes called for butter, cream, multiple eggs, generous amounts of meat and sugar. They were written for ordinary home cooks, not for people carefully rationing scarce resources. Liesel sat in the kitchen during her break, slowly paging through the book, reading recipes for pot roast, fried chicken, chocolate cake, apple pie. Each recipe was another piece of evidence that America had not been suffering the privations she had been told were destroying their nation. Frida joined the kitchen work soon after, her nursing background making her naturally careful about cleanliness and food safety. She and Liesel developed an efficient partnership, communicating sometimes in German, sometimes in halting English, sometimes in the wordless coordination of people working toward shared tasks. The work was hard, but satisfying. They were feeding people, including themselves and their fellow prisoners. They were learning skills that might prove useful in whatever uncertain future awaited them. And they were building tentative friendships with Americans who treated them not as enemies, but as fellow human beings worthy of patience and kindness. December brought the first opportunity for the prisoners to send letters home through the International Red Cross. Captain Caldwell explained the rules carefully. Letters would be censored to prevent any military intelligence from being transmitted, but personal news would be allowed. The women could write to family members, letting them know they were alive and being treated according to the Geneva Convention. For many of the prisoners, this was the first chance to communicate with home since their capture. Liesel sat at one of the long tables in the common room with a blank piece of paper before her and a pen in her hand. Around her, other women struggled with the same impossible task. How could they write honestly about their experience without revealing things that would never pass the censors or that their families would never believe? How could they describe what they had learned about American abundance without sounding like they had been brainwashed by enemy propaganda? She began several times, crossing out each attempt. Dear Mutti and Papa, I am well and being treated fairly. That seemed safe enough, but inadequate. The Americans are not what we were told. That would definitely be censored. I have learned to make pancakes and hamburgers. That sounded insane, without context. Finally, she settled on carefully chosen words that might convey truth without triggering the censor's pen. Dear Mutti and Papa, I am alive and healthy. The camp provides adequate food and shelter. I have been assigned to work in the kitchen, where I am learning about American cooking. It is very different from what we were told to expect. The people here are not cruel. I think often of home and pray that you are safe. I hope to hear from you soon. Your loving daughter, Liesel. She read it over 3 times, trying to see it through the eyes of a censor and through the eyes of her parents. Would her mother understand the significance of very different from what we were told? Would her father, who had never questioned the Reich's pronouncements about anything, be able to hear what she was really trying to say? Frida was crying quietly as she wrote her letter, tears falling onto the paper and smudging the ink. Greta had given up entirely, staring at her blank page, with an expression of helpless frustration. Thea wrote with fierce concentration, her pen moving quickly, as if speed might help her outrun the emotions threatening to overwhelm her careful composure. When they submitted their letters to Captain Caldwell for review, she read through them with a thoughtful expression. Most passed without comment. A few required minor edits, where the women had inadvertently included information about camp location or security procedures. But Caldwell noticed the common thread running through nearly every letter, the careful attempts to hint at truths that contradicted German propaganda without stating it explicitly. "You want your families to know what you've discovered here," she said quietly to Liesel, who had lingered after the others left. "You want them to understand that things are not what they were told." Liesel nodded, not trusting herself to speak. November 23, 1944, marked the American holiday called Thanksgiving. Captain Caldwell had debated whether to include the German prisoners in the celebration, concerned it might be seen as forced assimilation or cultural insensitivity, but Sergeant Drummond had argued that food was a universal language and that excluding them would be crueler than including them. The compromise was to explain the holiday's significance and allow the women to participate if they chose. All 17 prisoners chose to attend. The dining hall had been transformed. Long tables were pushed together and covered with white sheets serving as tablecloths. American soldiers and German prisoners would eat together, a radical departure from the normal separation of captors and captive. The smell that filled the building was overwhelming in its richness and complexity. Roasted turkey, stuffing fragrant with sage and onions, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, fresh baked rolls, green bean casserole, mashed potatoes, and multiple pies waiting for dessert. It was abundance on a scale that made even the hamburgers seem modest by comparison. Corporal Whitlock had been assigned to explain the holiday to the German women. He stood awkwardly before them, clearly uncomfortable with public speaking, but earnest in his attempt. "Thanksgiving is about being grateful for what we have," he said slowly, allowing time for translation. "It started a long time ago when the first European settlers in America were helped by Native Americans who taught them how to survive. They shared a meal together to celebrate the harvest and give thanks." He paused, seeming to recognize the irony of explaining a holiday about sharing food to people who had been starving for years. "I know this might seem strange to you. All this food when there's a war going on. But that's kind of the point of Thanksgiving. Even in hard times, we're supposed to remember what we're grateful for and share what we have with others." When the food was served, Liesel found herself sitting between Sergeant Drummond and Frida. The turkey alone was more meat than she had seen on a single platter in years. Drummond showed her how to take slices of both white and dark meat, how to pour gravy over the stuffing, how to combine the various dishes on her plate. "Don't be shy," he said with a gentle smile. "There's plenty. We made enough to feed twice this many people. That's the Thanksgiving way. Always make too much." The first bite of turkey, moist and perfectly seasoned, triggered a familiar response: tears. But this time they were different. Not the shocked, devastating tears of the hamburger incident, but something quieter and more profound. These were tears of gratitude mixed with grief. Gratitude for the unexpected kindness of these Americans who treated their enemies with such dignity. Grief for the years of lies, for the suffering that had been unnecessary, for the realization of how profoundly she had been deceived. Around the table, other women were having similar moments. Some cried openly. Others ate in stunned silence. A few even managed small smiles, allowing themselves to experience simple pleasure in good food and unexpected community. December brought news that shattered what remained of the prisoners' carefully constructed worldview. American newspapers began publishing preliminary reports from liberated areas in Eastern Europe. Stories emerged about camps that were not prisoner of war facilities, but something far more sinister. Places with names like Majdanek and Treblinka. Facilities designed not for detention, but for systematic murder. The reports were fragmentary and often dismissed as propaganda by those who could not conceive of such horror, but the details were consistent and disturbing. Captain Caldwell made the difficult decision to allow the German women access to these newspapers. She believed they had a right to know what was being discovered, even though she understood the psychological impact would be severe. The first time Liesel sat in the camp, library reading accounts of mass graves and gas chambers, her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the pages. The words seemed impossible, like some fever dream conjured by a disturbed mind. But the photographs, grainy and horrific, suggested these reports were not fabrications. Frida found her there, tears streaming down her face as she read. "This cannot be real," Liesel whispered in German. "Our country could not have done this. We would have known. Someone would have told us." But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept in. If they had lied about American starvation, about the weakness of the Allied forces, about the reasons for the war, what else had they concealed? What other truths had been buried under layers of propaganda and misdirection? The women gathered that evening in their barracks, speaking in hushed, urgent German about what they had read. Thea, who had always been the most pragmatic among them, voiced what others were thinking but could not say. "We served this. We were part of this system. It does not matter that we did not know. We helped it function. We believed the lies and repeated them. We are complicit." Her words hung in the cold air like an accusation none of them could refute. Greta, young and devastated, sobbed into her pillow. "I thought we were defending our homeland. I thought we were the victims, that everyone else wanted to destroy Germany, but we were the destroyers. We were the monsters." The other women had no comfort to offer, because they were grappling with the same horrifying realization. Everything they had believed about their country's righteousness had been inverted. They were not defenders, but accomplices, not victims, but perpetrators of something whose full scope they were only beginning to comprehend. Over the following weeks, more information emerged. Reports from concentration camps liberated by Soviet forces, testimonies from survivors, documentation of systematic policies designed to eliminate entire populations. Each new revelation was another wound to the prisoners' understanding of themselves and their nation. They had worn their uniforms with pride. They had believed they served justice and civilization. Now they understood they had served something unspeakable, and that ignorance was not innocence, but rather a form of willing blindness they could no longer maintain. The psychological impact of these revelations manifested differently in each woman. Some, like Thea, retreated into silence, speaking only when necessary, and spending hours staring at nothing. Others, like Greta, cycled between denial and despair, one day insisting the reports must be exaggerated propaganda, the next day consumed with guilt for having doubted the evidence. Frida threw herself into work with manic intensity, as if exhausting her body might quiet her mind. Liesel found herself in the kitchen at odd hours, unable to sleep, seeking the comfort of familiar tasks and Sergeant Drummond's steady presence. He did not push her to talk, but made space for conversation if she needed it. One night she finally asked the question that had been tormenting her. "How can you be kind to us? Now that you know what our country did, how can you feed us and treat us like human beings when we served that?" Her English had improved enough to express complex thoughts, though her voice shook with emotion. Drummond was quiet for a long moment, carefully considering his response. "I've been thinking about that myself," he admitted. "Truth is, I don't know what I would have done if I'd been born in Germany instead of Pennsylvania. If I'd been raised hearing the same lies you heard, seeing the same propaganda you saw. Maybe I would have believed it too. Maybe I would have served the same system." He looked directly at her. What matters now is what you do with the truth once you know it. You can't change what you didn't know before, but you can choose how you move forward." His words offered no easy absolution, but they provided something equally important: the possibility that knowledge could lead to redemption rather than just guilt. The idea that discovering the truth, however painful, was itself a form of resistance against the lies that had enabled such horror. Liesel wrote in her notebook that night, "We cannot undo what was done. We cannot reclaim our ignorance, but perhaps we can choose to be different people than we were. Perhaps that is the only meaningful response to discovering you have been complicit in evil." Chaplain Arthur Brennan began holding informal discussion groups for any prisoners who wanted to attend. The Irish-American priest had seen enough of human nature to understand that guilt without path toward redemption became toxic and destructive. He did not offer easy forgiveness or minimize the severity of what had been discovered. Instead, he focused on the theological and philosophical questions of responsibility, knowledge, and moral reconstruction. How does one rebuild an ethical framework after discovering the previous one was built on lies? His approach resonated particularly with the women because he did not treat them as monsters or victims, but as moral agents capable of growth and change. "You cannot carry the guilt for everything your nation did," he told them during one session, "but you can carry responsibility for who you choose to become now that you know the truth. That is hard, uncomfortable work, but it is the only work that matters." March 1945 brought the first hints of spring to Massachusetts and the first rumors of Germany's impending collapse. The war in Europe was entering its final phase. Allied forces advanced from both east and west, squeezing what remained of the Reich into an ever smaller territory. For the German women at Fort Deans, these developments brought a mixture of relief that the killing would soon end and dread about what would come after. What kind of Germany would exist when the fighting stopped? What would become of them? Captain Caldwell received preliminary orders regarding repatriation procedures for prisoners of war. The process would be complicated by the destruction of German infrastructure and the chaos of occupation, but eventually all prisoners would be returned to their homeland. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps before being released to whatever remained of their former lives. Caldwell called a meeting to explain these procedures, expecting relief or at least resignation. What she did not expect was the conversation that followed. Liesel had been chosen as spokesperson by the other women. Her English was now fluent enough for complex discussions, and her work in the kitchen had given her a rapport with the American staff that the others lacked. She stood before Captain Caldwell with visible nervousness, her hands clasped tightly to stop them from shaking. "Captain, we have been discussing among ourselves. We know that we will be required to return to Germany eventually, but we wanted to ask if there might be any possibility of delaying that return or perhaps making other arrangements." Caldwell's expression showed surprise. "You want to delay repatriation? Can I ask why?" The question opened a floodgate. Liesel explained that many of them had lost contact with their families months or even years ago. Letters sent through the Red Cross had gone unanswered, suggesting that homes and relatives might no longer exist. They had read enough about conditions in Germany to know they would be returning to devastation, homelessness, and chaos. More than that, they had read enough about how Germans were treating returnees from Allied captivity. Women who had been captured were viewed with suspicion, accused of collaboration, or worse. "But there is something more," Liesel continued, her voice dropping. "We have learned things here, about our country, about ourselves, about what is possible when people choose kindness over cruelty. We have been treated with more dignity as prisoners than we saw our own government treat its citizens. We have been fed better as enemies than our own soldiers were fed. We have found something here that we never had in Germany, even before the war." She paused, searching for the right words. "We have found the possibility of becoming different people than we were, and we are afraid that if we return to Germany now, We will lose that possibility." Her words revealed the depth of transformation these women had undergone. They were not simply prisoners waiting to go home. They had become people questioning whether home still existed, and whether they wanted to return to it, even if it did. May 8, 1945 arrived with church bells ringing across America. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 years had finally ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. In prisoner of war camps across the United States, German soldiers received the news with mixed emotions: relief that the killing had stopped, despair at their nation's total defeat, uncertainty about what kind of country they would return to. At Fort Deans, the 17 women gathered in the common room to hear Captain Caldwell's announcement about their future. "Ladies," Caldwell began, her voice steady but compassionate, "as you know, the war in Europe has ended. You are no longer enemy combatants but displaced persons awaiting repatriation. The United States government has arranged transportation for all German prisoners to return home. You will be processed through camps in Europe and then released to make your way to wherever you choose to go in Germany." She paused, observing the expressions on their faces: fear, resignation, and something else she had not expected: desperation. Liesel stood slowly, as she had done countless times over the past months when serving as spokesperson, but this time her voice carried a different quality. Not the hesitant uncertainty of a prisoner making a request, but the firm determination of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. "Captain Caldwell, may I speak for some of us?" Permission was granted with a nod. Liesel looked around at her fellow prisoners, seeing confirmation in their faces. 14 women stood with her: Frida, Thea, Greta, and 10 others who had been part of endless nighttime conversations about this exact moment. "We do not wish to return to Germany," Liesel said clearly in English that no longer required translation. "We know this is unusual. We know it creates complications, but we are formally requesting to remain in the United States rather than accept repatriation." The silence that followed was profound. American guards exchanged confused glances. The 3 German women who remained seated looked at their standing compatriots with expressions of shock and betrayal. Captain Caldwell appeared genuinely speechless for one of the few times in her military career. "I need to understand what you're asking," Caldwell finally said. "You want to remain in American custody rather than return home as free women?" Frida spoke up, her voice shaking but determined. "Germany is not our home anymore. The country we served does not exist. The values we thought we were defending were lies. Our families are likely dead or scattered. We would return to nothing but destruction and suspicion." She gestured around the room. "Here we have found work that gives us purpose. We have been treated with dignity even as enemies. We have learned what it means to live without fear and lies." Thea added her voice to the appeal. "We know what we are asking is unprecedented, but we have spent 6 months discovering that the Germany we believed in never existed. The America we were told was our enemy has shown us more humanity than our own government ever did. We do not want to go back to lies. We want to stay where truth is possible." The request triggered immediate crisis discussions among American military and civilian authorities. There was no precedent for prisoners of war requesting to remain in captivity rather than accepting freedom and repatriation. The legal implications were complex. The Geneva Convention provided for the return of prisoners, but did not address what to do when prisoners refused repatriation. The political implications were even more complicated. Allowing German nationals to remain in the United States while American soldiers were still dying in the Pacific Theater would be controversial at best. Captain Caldwell sent urgent communications to her superiors in Washington while the camp existed in a strange state of suspended animation. The 14 women who had requested to stay continued their daily routines with intensified purpose, as if demonstrating their value might influence distant decision-makers. The 3 who had chosen repatriation kept mostly to themselves, uncomfortable with what they saw as betrayal of the fatherland by their former comrades. The division was painful but perhaps inevitable given the magnitude of the choice involved. Corporal Whitlock approached Caldwell privately to express his support for the women's request. "Ma'am, I know I'm just a corporal and my opinion doesn't count for much, but these women aren't our enemies anymore. They're just people who got caught up in something bigger than they understood. Sending them back to nothing seems wrong when we could give them a chance here." His words echoed similar sentiments expressed by Sergeant Drummond, Chaplain Brennan, and even Dr. Ashford, who had watched the women's psychological transformation with professional interest. The response from Washington arrived 10 days later. It was characteristically bureaucratic, but unexpectedly flexible. The War Department acknowledged the unprecedented nature of the request and recognized that forcing repatriation on unwilling individuals would create its own complications. The compromise solution was to reclassify the women from prisoners of war to displaced persons. They would no longer be held in military custody, but would need to find civilian sponsors willing to provide housing and support while they applied for immigration status through normal channels. The decision meant the women would be taking an enormous risk. They would lose the security of military custody, the guaranteed food and shelter they had come to rely on. They would need to find Americans willing to sponsor former enemy nationals during a time when anti-German sentiment remained strong. They would face an uncertain legal process with no guarantee of success. Several of the 14 reconsidered their decision when confronted with these realities. 2 decided the uncertainty was too great and chose repatriation after all. But 12 women, led by Liesel, Frida, Thea, and Greta, chose to accept the risk and uncertainty of remaining in America over the certainty of returning to a Germany that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The process of finding sponsors proved less difficult than anticipated. Mrs. Constance Pemberton, the school teacher who had been visiting the camp as part of a church outreach program, immediately offered to sponsor Liesel. Dr. Ashford arranged for Frida to continue medical training at a local hospital where he had connections. Other families, moved by the women's story and their obvious sincerity, stepped forward to offer support. The transition from military custody to civilian life happened gradually over the summer of 1945. The women were released in small groups as sponsors were confirmed and housing arranged. Liesel moved into a spare bedroom in the Pemberton home in early June, carrying everything she owned in a single small suitcase. Her leather notebook, now filled with months of observations and reflections, remained her most precious possession. Mrs. Pemberton treated her not as a charity case, but as a paying boarder who happened to need temporary support preserving Liesel's dignity while providing necessary help. Finding work was the first challenge. Liesel's fluency in both German and English made her valuable as a translator, and Mrs. Pemberton's connections in the local school system led to part-time work helping German-speaking refugees navigate American bureaucracy. The work was emotionally difficult, as it required daily confrontation with the reality of what Germany had become. Displaced persons arrived with stories of horror, loss, and trauma. They looked to Liesel for help understanding a country and language that remained foreign to them, and she tried to provide that help while carrying her own burden of guilt and grief. Frida's path was more straightforward but equally challenging. Dr. Ashford had arranged for her to work as a nursing assistant at Worcester General Hospital while studying for American nursing certification. The medical knowledge she had, gained in German field hospitals, translated well, but the American approach to healthcare was different in fundamental ways. There was more emphasis on patient comfort, more resources available for pain management, more respect for patient autonomy. She had to unlearn habits formed in environments where scarcity and military hierarchy had shaped every decision. Thea found work as a secretary for a local manufacturing company. Her administrative skills were immediately useful, though her German precision and efficiency sometimes clashed with more relaxed American workplace culture. She learned to navigate the informal hierarchies and casual social interactions that characterized American business life. Greta, the youngest, struggled most with the transition. At 19, she had limited work experience and no clear professional direction. She eventually found a position at a local library where her careful attention to detail and emerging English skills made her valuable in cataloging and shelving. The women maintained close contact with each other, meeting weekly to share experiences and provide mutual support. These gatherings became vital to their psychological survival. They could speak German freely, express doubts and fears without judgment, and remind each other why they had chosen this difficult path. They also maintained correspondence with the 5 women who had chosen repatriation, creating a network that spanned the Atlantic and provided perspective on what life would have been like had they made different choices. The letters from Germany painted a picture of devastation, but also resilience. The women who returned found their cities in ruins, their families scattered or dead, their former certainties completely shattered. But they also found opportunities to participate in rebuilding, to be part of creating a new Germany that might learn from the catastrophic failures of the old one. Their experiences in American captivity had given them unique perspectives that proved valuable in a country struggling to understand how it had gone so terribly wrong. 20 years after that spring day, when 12 German women chose America over their homeland, Liesl Voss Pemberton stood at the arrival gate of Frankfurt Airport. She had married Thomas Pemberton, Mrs. Pemberton's nephew, in 1948 and built a life that once seemed impossible. 2 children, a house in suburban Massachusetts, work as a translator for the State Department. She had become an American citizen in 1952, taking the oath with tears streaming down her face as she swore allegiance to the country that had shown her mercy when she least deserved it. Now she was returning to Germany for the first time since the war, invited to speak at a conference on reconciliation and reconstruction. The country she found bore almost no resemblance to the one she had left. Modern buildings rose where ruins had stood. Prosperity had replaced devastation. Democracy had replaced dictatorship. Most remarkably, the new Germany had confronted its past with a brutal honesty that would have been unimaginable 2 decades earlier. Schools taught children about the Holocaust. Memorials honored victims. The national identity had been rebuilt around the determination to never again allow such horror. Frida had come with her, now Dr. Frida Zimmerman, head of nursing at Worcester General Hospital. She had never married, dedicating her life instead to caring for others as a form of perpetual atonement. Her medical expertise had saved countless lives, but she still carried the weight of having once served a regime that systematically murdered the vulnerable and sick. Thea and Greta had remained in America as well, building careers and families that embodied the second chances they had been given. The conference brought together Germans and Americans who had lived through the war years, creating space for difficult conversations about guilt, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. Liesel's speech focused on her experience in the prisoner of war camp, the moment when a hamburger had shattered her entire worldview, the kindness of Americans who had every reason to hate her but chose mercy instead. She spoke about Sergeant Drummond patiently teaching her to make pancakes, about Corporal Whitlock's simple decency, about Captain Caldwell's firm but compassionate leadership. "I learned that home is not where you come from," she told the assembled audience in German that still carried the accent of her northern origins. "Home is where you choose to build a life that honors human dignity rather than destroying it. America gave me that choice when my own country had taken it away." The hamburger I cried over in November 1944 was not just food. It was evidence that everything I believed was false. It was proof that I had been lied to about the most basic realities. It was the beginning of understanding that redemption was possible if I was willing to do the hard work of becoming a different person. Her words resonated because they were specific and honest. She did not minimize German guilt or claim that American kindness erased German crimes. She simply testified to the power of treating enemies with dignity. The story of the German women who chose America over repatriation became part of a larger narrative about post-war reconciliation. Historians studied their case as an example of how treating prisoners with humanity could transform enemies into allies. Policymakers referenced their experience when designing programs for refugees and displaced persons. Educators used their story to illustrate that individual transformation was possible even in the darkest circumstances. But for Liesel, Frida, Thea, Greta, and the others who had made that impossible choice, the meaning was both simpler and more profound. They had been given a choice when they expected only to be returned to whatever fate awaited them. That choice, and the months of experience that informed it, had changed the trajectory of their entire lives. They had arrived in America as true believers in Nazi ideology, convinced that Germans were superior and Americans were weak enemies barely worth defeating. They had left as something entirely different. Not perfect, not free from guilt, but fundamentally changed in ways that shaped everything that followed. By 1970, all 12 women who had remained in America had built successful lives. They had careers, families, and communities that valued their contributions. They had also maintained connections with the women who had chosen repatriation, creating a network of shared experience that transcended the Atlantic. Those who had returned to Germany had played important roles in reconstruction and reconciliation efforts, carrying with them lessons learned during their American captivity about the possibility of forgiveness and second chances. Liesel's granddaughter, studying history at university, once asked her why she thought the Americans had been so kind to their prisoners. "They had every reason to hate us," the young woman said. "We were Nazis. Our country had killed millions. Why did they treat you with such humanity?" Liesel thought carefully before answering. "Because they understood something we had forgotten, that seeing the humanity in your enemy does not make you weak. It makes you strong enough to break the cycle of hatred that creates wars in the first place." The leather notebook that had accompanied Liesel through her entire journey sat in a place of honor in her study. Inside its pages were the crossed-out lies from Oberleutnant Werner's briefing, followed by years of observations about kindness, abundance, and the possibility of transformation. On the final page, written in careful English, were words she had composed on the day she became an American citizen. "I came to this country as an enemy. I remained as a prisoner. I became a citizen through choice. The hamburger that made me cry was not just food. It was the first true thing I had experienced in years. It was the beginning of understanding that I could choose to be different than I was raised to be. America did not give me that hamburger to break me. They gave it to me because treating even enemies with dignity is what they believed was right. That simple act of providing good food to people who expected starvation saved my life, in ways that had nothing to do with physical hunger. It saved my soul."